welcoming Dr. Janet Smith.
Well, thank you. Oh my gosh, I didn't see this room full. It's just about full. Pat, stand up and look. It's amazing. Thank you all for coming. It's just remarkable. I always like coming back to this area. I taught at the University of Dallas for 12 years, and so it's really, really nice to be back. And I'm delighted that we have the sign language for the hearing impaired. Welcome very much. I hope you're all seen the movie A Quiet Place, right? You're all heroes, right, in that? So that's just great. But yes, this is the 50th year anniversary of Humanae Vitae. I can see some of you have been around that whole time. I'm one of those that have been around that whole time. I was 18 when Humanae Vitae was released. It didn't make any impact on my consciousness at all. I didn't really know anything about it until about 7 or 8 years later, and then various things caught my interest, and it's been sort of nonstop since then. 25 years ago was the occasion where I gave some talks that made us tape my talk, Contraception, Why Not? So that's almost 25 years old. So, you know, yeah, exactly, unbelievable. I remember at the time, I was asked, in the 25th year anniversary, I was asked to speak at 9 weekends in a row, I think. And a big one was Tom Hilger's at the Creighton Institute, Pope Paul VI Institute. I think there were 600 people there anyway, and everybody was stunned that you could get 600 people to come listen to something about Humanae Vitae. And I thought with my 9 in a row, I said I had to take all of them because it was going to stop after that. I said, it's just going to stop. Nobody's interested. This just is a glitch. And it hasn't stopped for 25 years. And the number of people who are interested in the issue is just astonishing to me how it grows over the years. I'll talk about some of the reasons for that. But, I mean, some of you know this is going to be kind of a walk down memory lane for you, and some of you it's going to be all news, how Humanae Vitae came about. It was kind of a bomb when it came out. Not the bomb that bombed, but it blew up things. In a certain sense, it blew up the church. And the church has been recovering for the last 50 years. It has recovered very well, though there are new threats to Humanae Vitae that have arisen. But the progress has been good. And, you know, I'm very optimistic, honestly. This was the kind of thing that was put out in 1968. That's Pope Paul VI, and if you can read the banner, it says Rebellion in the Catholic Church. And 1968 was a banner year. I know many young people, college students and younger, are kind of astonished at this last year for the number of demonstrations there's been in public unrest, and even, you know, beheadings in the Near East, and all sorts of things that are very, very, very unpleasant. And you're thinking, it has a life of its own over here. I don't know what that's all about. All right. 1968 was an incredible year, and it rivals 2017 and 2018 as being a wild year. We had all sorts of, I mean, I was even a kind of little hippie. I'll talk about that a little bit in 1968. It's hard to be a hippie when you grow up in a conservative Republican community in a small town in Pennsylvania, but I tried. I failed, honestly, but I tried. It was the same year that Martin Luther King was shot. It was the year that Bobby Kennedy was shot. I mean, really, you just sort of got up in the morning and you didn't know what was next. It was very, very unsettling. There were, you know, beatings of demonstrators in the streets. There was people burned their draft cards. There was on TV assassinations of people in the streets. There were demonstrations at the Olympics. So, you know, sort of our the Black Lives Matters and the kneeling down at the football games and everything. That this was it's all deja vu for me. It's like we've been there before. We had Gloria Steinem, who was telling us we all needed to be feminists. I mean, in a certain sense, nothing compared to even the transgenderism that's going on now. I mean, talk about unsettling. This is just going on its own over here. I have to keep up with it. That's probably good. There were bra burners, demonstrations on abortion. Then there was, of course, the whole population scare. This was huge. In 1968, there were pictures in my classrooms where we thought people were going to fall off the globe. There were so many people on the face of the face of the earth. It was a major reason that the church had a special commission to examine the question of contraception, because there were conferences being held at the UN about what to do about overpopulation. We had relatively tame musical groups at the time, all right? But the long hair and everything was considered to be a bit, this is really going, was considered to be, well, the long hair and everything was really rebellious. The skirts changed in the course of a year from long to, that was considered a short skirt, girls. That's incredible, the shortest one there. Then we were all so happy, right? A lot of drugs, a lot of promiscuity. When I went off to college, my parents had no idea what I was going to meet there. You know, that you could get drugs with no trouble. Everybody was expected to be engaging in sex. Oh my gosh. So this was me in 1968, all right? And I was a college freshman in 1968. I actually went to a discussion about abortion on campus. It was in Iowa. And there were women in Iowa that were trying to get the abortion laws changed. And I honestly was 19 years of age, and I had never heard of contraception. I mean, of abortion. I'd never heard of abortion. It was possible, right? In 1968 and 69. And I stopped at the library on my way to the meeting, and this was Grinnell College in Iowa, which was a very radical school. I wanted to go to a radical school. I actually chose the school because the first thing I saw was this guy with these gorgeous sideburns. That sort of, I've always been a deep and profound person. And so that really was a major factor in my choosing Grinnell College in Iowa, a very radical school. And I went to the library, looked up abortion. I was shocked that women did that. And I had left the church for a while, and it said that the Catholic Church was opposed to abortion. I said, well, I'm not surprised by it. Of course, I never knew that because I'd never heard of abortion. So I went to the meeting, and with all the naivete in the world, I raised my hand and I said, you know, I'm ready to write letters, but I need to know, when do we think human life begins? Because that's the crucial question. I learned that from the encyclopedia entry. The big question is, when does human life begin? And the organizers started yelling at me. They said, shut up, sit down, we don't need your kind here. And I'm saying, what kind am I? And they said, we don't need any right-to-lifers here. Well, of course, I'd never heard of right to life because I'd never heard of abortion. You know, and I'm looking around the room. I mean, that isn't what I looked like by the time I went to that meeting. I had little wiring glasses and long, straggly hair. And again, we were all trying to look like John Lennon. And I had achieved it as well as anyone else, you know, the women and the men were all trying to look like John Lennon. And I looked around the room and I said, I'm trying my best to be just like everybody else, so what is this? We don't need your kind here. So fast forward, and people would come up to me on campus and they'd say, we're here, you're against abortion. And I said, I don't know, but I know there's questions that need to be answered. And before about 2 months or so, I was very opposed to abortion. And people were very surprised at that. And I said, well, I'm surprised that you're not, you know, once you start thinking through the issues. Then many years later, I got very involved in the pro-life movement. A number of friends and I in graduate school had read Humanae Vitae because we'd become very enthusiastic Catholics and we wanted to be able to defend all of the church's teaching. And so we sat down and read Humanae Vitae and said, boy, we think this is really defensible. And then I started doing sidewalk counseling outside of abortion clinics. And we'd meet these young women coming down the street to go to the abortion clinic, and they were like 15, 16, they weren't going to the abortion clinic actually. They were going to Planned Parenthood, which is 2 blocks further south. And I'd look at them and I'd sort of stop them. I'd say, are you going down to Planned Parenthood? And they, yes. And I said, well, I hate to tell you, take a look at this. This is an abortion clinic. And the chances are you might be coming here in a couple months. I said, but there's a place where you can get help, not to go to an abortion clinic. I said, it's not going to do any good to go to Planned Parenthood because it's going to head you down the path towards an abortion. I ended up setting up a pregnancy help center right next door to this abortion clinic in South Bend. I started teaching Humanae Vitae in one of my classes at Notre Dame. It sort of worked against my getting tenure. I actually had an amazing experience where I was teaching Humanae Vitae in one of my classes, and I asked to the students, which wasn't fair at all because they're sophomores, but I I mean, one reason you become a professor is so you can be unfair to people. And so I asked, I said, how many of you think the church is wrong about its teaching on contraception? And all their hands went up. And I said, how many of you have read Humanae Vitae? None of their hands went up. I said, how many of you have spent 5 minutes or more thinking about the issue? None of their hands went up. And I said, well, I think it's about time we read it and see what the church teaches. Well, they ran off to another professor and said, Professor Smith is teaching Humanae Vitae, and she supports it. And he said, I've always thought she's intelligent. I don't know why she would hold that position. And so, the students said, well, we'll have a debate. We'll have a debate. So 2 weeks later, we had a debate. And to his credit, I made the same kind of introduction I'm making here, how people haven't read it, and they've made up their minds about the issue. And he actually turned bright red. And he said, I didn't read it until this afternoon. And my wife and I had been contracepting for 15 years. Now, my students were just, speechless, because he had agreed 2 weeks ago to debate the issue that he'd never read the document, certainly nothing else about it. So it's kind of really eye-opening for them that people have views on this and they've never even read the document. I say most people, a lot of people, most people are certainly graduates from high school. And how many have had some college and graduated from high school? And most of us read, we used to read newspapers, now we read stuff online, we read Time Magazine or Sports Illustrated or People, and we don't bother to read church documents. Why do we think God gave us this education? Why did he give it to us? What's a better use for our education than to read what the church teaches? And now you can get things hot off the presses on the internet. Any new teaching or not teaching, but encyclical that comes out, it's ready for us. All right, so that's a little bit of my background of my interest. But 1968 was quite the year. And when Humanae Vitae came out, it just sort of rocked everything. So let's look at a little context. All Christian churches were opposed to contraception up until 1968. This is what Luther said. Think about this. The purpose of marriage is not pleasure and ease, but the procreation and education of children and support of a family. People who do not like children are swine, dunces, and blockheads, not worthy to be called men and women because they despise the blessings of God, the creator and author of marriage. It's incredible. Can you imagine if a Holy Father used these words in a document? It kind of makes me really like Luther, Right, so all Christian denominations were opposed to contraception. Gandhi was opposed to contraception. He said there can be no two opinions about the necessity of birth control, not contraception. But the only method handed down from ages past is self-control. It's an infallible, sovereign remedy doing good to those who practice it, and medical men will earn the gratitude of mankind if, instead of devising artificial means of birth control, they will find out the means of self-control, which is, of course, very much what natural family planning is. Now, we had laws against contraception in the United States. Right? Laws put on the books by Protestant legislators. One was a minister, Anthony Comstock, and he'd been to New York City, and he'd seen all this lascivious dancing and pornography, and he said, what's the source of this? And he actually, in promiscuity, he traced it to contraception. Now, in 1873, there were very few contraceptives. We're talking largely about the condom and some early forms of the diaphragm. The pill wasn't invented until the late 1950s. Right? But he had laws put on the books against contraception, against distributing it, selling it, using it, etc. Those were put on the books by Protestant legislators, largely kept on the book by Catholics, but put on the books by Protestants. Now, Margaret Sanger, as you know, was the founder of Planned Parenthood. A lot of people don't know that she was a eugenist, meaning that she was trying to get rid of people who weren't, to her mind, desirable, right? They weren't fit. So this is this passage written by her. She says, like the advocates of birth control, the eugenists, for instance, are seeking to assist the race toward the elimination of the unfit. Both are seeking a single end, but they lay emphasis upon different methods. Eugenics without birth control seems to us a house builded upon the sands. It is at the mercy of the rising stream of the unfit. And the unfit at this time were largely considered to be African Americans and immigrants who were largely Catholics. Right? There were too many of them. They were breeding, so Planned Parenthood was going to get rid of them. And of course, you know, Planned Parenthood it most wants to have its offices in inner city neighborhoods, and there's a much higher rate of abortion in those neighborhoods for African Americans. There's kind of eugenics going on right now in our culture. It's a matter of great sadness. It's got a life of its own. That one of the inventors of contraception was a Dr. John Rock, who was a Catholic. He actually went to daily mass. But he was quite unethical. He even knew that some of these early forms of contraception most likely worked by causing abortions. You know, Catholics don't have a good record on any of these matters. When you look at the US Congress and the Senate and who was the most pro-abortion people, sometimes it's the Catholics. And it's just really hard to take in my mind. So we should all pray for John Rock, for his soul, that he will be relieved of the burden that he put on the rest of the world. Right? So that's a little bit of the background. Still more here is what is church teaching. There's a big fat book written by a man named John Noonan entitled Contraception, A History of Its Treatment by the Catholic Theologians and Canonists. Now, John Noonan was a very famous legal scholar. He actually wrote a wonderful book about abortion, is still of much value, something like nearly an absolute value in history. But this book was written with the intention of helping the church change its teaching on contraception. Right? He was working to get the church to change its teaching. So he did a historical study of what the church has taught, what it teaches now, but he tried to find some room in there for saying it could change its teaching. He did note at the beginning of the book that the church's teaching was a nearly what he called an unbroken tradition. He said, since the first clear mention of contraception by a Christian theologian, when a harsh 3rd century moralist accused a pope of encouraging it, the articulated judgment has been the same. In the world of the late empire, known to St. Jerome and St. Augustine, through all the other parts of the world in different periods of time, go back down to the last 3 lines, the teachers of the church have taught without hesitation or variation that certain acts preventing procreation are gravely sinful. It often surprises young people to hear that all Christian churches opposed contraception until 1930, and so there just wasn't debate. There wasn't a debate about it. Right? There weren't many contraceptives that could be used, but there really wasn't a debate about it. As even Noonan concludes, he says, no Catholic theologian has ever taught contraception is a good act. He said, the teaching on contraception is clear and apparently fixed forever. Now, he wrote this book in order to help the church change its teaching, but he had to admit it had always taught it, and it didn't look like there was a lot of wiggle room. It was in 1930 that the Anglicans, for the first of all the churches, Catholic Christian churches, decided that contraception could be used for serious reasons within marriage. If you go back and you look at the documents at the time, there was almost no defense given for it, except that having a lot of kids is hard, which is true, right? A lot of things are hard. A lot of things are hard, and it doesn't mean that you can change the moral law because things are hard. It's hard to make things meet financially sometimes, but it doesn't mean you can go out and steal in order to do that. There's hard things there's things in your life that are hard might be solved by a few lies you could tell, but it doesn't mean it's right to tell the lies. But there were almost no arguments given for contraception at the Lambeth Conference. It was just sort of said, well, more and more people seem to be wanting to use the condom. Life is, difficult. We should let people do it. In that same year, Pius XI put out a beautiful encyclical called Casti Connubii. I highly recommend reading that, especially those of you preparing for marriage or anybody married. It gives you, again, a very good idea of what marriage is and what God wants from the marriage. Beautiful document. But he reasserted what the church had always taught about contraception. It wasn't a new teaching. He just said maybe we need to emphasize it again, since the Anglican Church and many churches followed the Anglican Church after they said it was morally permissible. Again, there was no debate in the Catholic Church after this point. It's not as if there were articles being written or speeches being given about why Catholics should accept contraception. It was settled. And there's a marvelous book, again, written with the intention of changing the Church's teaching on contraception, but it's a pretty honest book. It's called An American History, Catholics, and Contraception by a lady historian. And she basically says, between Costi Connubii and the 1960 or so, Catholics lived by the Church's teaching, weren't grumbling about it much. They were prosperous, they were having kids, and things were good. This is her conclusion. She said, many laity admired their church's increasingly lonely defense of a procreative sexual ethic. Many shared their clergy's anxieties when it came to emancipated views of sex. And a great many Catholics responded, I love this, with a visceral surge of tribal loyalty. I hope we're experiencing that today, a visceral surge of tribal loyalty when public proponents of birth control attacked the Catholic Church. The story was one of idealism, too, especially after the Second World War, when the teaching was increasingly presented in personalist terms and in a context of national prosperity. And I was a little kid in the 1950s, and we lived on a street where everybody was having kids. People loved to have kids. They really loved to have kids. A small family was considered to be 4, and you knew they were Protestants, right? And they thought it was a big family, right? Catholics had 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kids, and just everybody did. And it was just rollicking fun. There were just always playmates around. The parents loved getting together and talking with each other and watching the kids, and the neighborhood just kind of swarmed with children. And it was a time when my mother could let us out of the door in the morning and not have a bit of concern about what we were doing. Sort of just, can you tell me every once in a while where you are? If she sort of got some worries about it, she'd call out where she probably thought we were and say, have you seen Janet lately? And, oh yeah, she was here 20 minutes ago, but they all went there now. And everybody did keep tabs on everybody, and it was really something. Many years ago, about 20 years ago, one of my sisters had a little son, and he was starting to want to go play with friends at their houses, and she said, what do I have to know about the family that he might go visit? And I said, well, I think you have to do an FBI background check. And you have to find out, are the parents married? Do they have pornography in the house? Do they have unattended computers? What is the ethic of that household? What movies do they let their kids watch? Right? And I said, it's not like in my friends, they were a little bit afraid to let their kids go out in the backyard unattended. And again, I remember my mother basically out the door, and then later we'd come back. All right. One of the best things that's ever been written about contraception is Carol Wojtyia's book, Love and Responsibility, which was published in the late 1950s. It's a fantastic philosophical defense of the Church's teaching. Now, I haven't quite figured out why he thought we needed a philosophical defense at that time. What were the rumblings that were going on? But I have to say, I don't know that there's ever going to be a better philosophical defense given than this book. It's possible, everything's possible. Theological Studies is the journal of the American Catholic Theological Association. And in 1962, in there it said, 1962, since theological discussion of the anovulant drugs began some 4 or more years ago, moralists have never been less than unanimous in their assertion that natural law cannot countenance the use of these progestational steroids for the purpose of contraception, as that term is properly understood in the light of papal teaching. Again, the pill was being invented in the late 1950s, so theologians were asking, does the pill fall under the church's condemnation of contraception. The diaphragm and the condom had to be put on basically before or during the sexual act, and it seemed to interrupt the sexual act, but the pill didn't do that, so maybe it wasn't wrong. But theologians thought about it and they said, no, it's condemned, but it falls under the reasons why the church condemns contraception. That was 1962. Now, Pope Paul VI, who's soon going to be canonized, end of October, soon to be Saint Pope Paul VI, he inherited from John the 23rd a special commission that was looking into the church's teaching on contraception, not with the question of whether the church could and should change its teaching. It was looking into how are we going to present this teaching in the modern world that seems to be so concerned with overpopulation, and then there's this contraceptive pill is showing up. Again, before it was just the condom or the diaphragm. So how are we going to teach the church's teaching in the modern world? Well, Gaudium et Spes is the document that was produced by Vatican II, and there was a big question about whether or not Vatican II was going to take up the question of contraception at all. It was going to be left to this special commission. As I said, Paul VI had inherited the commission from Pope John the 23rd. That commission, I think, had only 6 members on it. Pope Paul VI put 66, the biggest commission that had ever been on a commission, but he wanted to get input from many different groups on how to teach this teaching. It wasn't a theological question, it was a pedagogical question, if you will. So he had demographers, he had social scientists, he had directors of family life offices, a lot of laity on the commission, medical doctors, right? And so Gaudium et Spes did, in fact, finally say something about it. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the book that relates what the Special Commission did lays out very well. This is a book by Robert McClory, who was the editor of the National Catholic Reporter at the time. And he talks about it was really quite an amazing commission. Their commission, again, was to figure out how the church should teach its teaching in the modern world. Somewhere along the line, they decided to make up their own mandate, which was and they decided to ask the question, could and should the church teach its teaching? Should it change its teaching? Could and should the church change its teaching on contraception? Now, that was never in Paul VI's mind as what that commission was meant to do. So we had a runaway commission. So there was a very famous Jesuit, theologian Jesuit, right? Smile about the Jesuits, so we don't have much occasion to do that, but John Ford was fantastic, and John Ford went and talked to Paul VI and said, you've got a runaway commission on your hands. They've taken up a topic you didn't give them to take up. And so he said, he wanted him to disband the commission. Well, one of the things that Paul VI did was he sent over to the Vatican II Council some footnotes he wanted to put in Gaudium et Spes that said what the church's teaching had always been on contraception. And when you do that, you're signaling what you think the church's teaching should be, because in the church, if something's always been taught, it's going to be really difficult ever to change it, because we believe we're guided by the Holy Spirit. So he did that, but he also put 15 increased the number of archbishops and cardinals on the commission up to the number of 15, who he made the only voting members of the commission, only voting members. And lo and behold, they voted that the church could and should change its teaching. 9 said yes, 3 said no, and 3 abstained. Shocking to the world. Again, if anybody looks at the documents, and they were never made official, the commission it just kind of stopped its work. It did have a majority report that said the church could and should change its teaching, and a minority report, which is a very small minority. But the arguments, nobody thinks the arguments are good on either side, because they didn't come to this commission prepared to do that. As I said, there hadn't been a discussion of theological consideration for years beforehand. This was like they got there and said, whoa, we could look at this question with new eyes. And there were 2 very important theologians, Bernard Herring, who was a Redemptorist, and Joseph Fuchs, who was a Jesuit. Fuchs, especially, Bernard Herring came in as a pro-contraceptive bishop, but no, he wasn't a bishop, just a theologian. And Fuchs did not. Fuchs was a very strong natural law theorist, but in the course of the commission, he changed his mind. These were the two top theologians in Rome, the two top theologians in Rome. And they had taught so many of the top theologians around the world who had come to Rome to study under them. And so when they were promoting contraception, all of the theologians that had studied under them were likely to change. And they taught the people they taught the teachers of the seminaries and the universities, so it came right from Rome. Right? One of the major dissenters was Father Charles Curran. Some of you will know that name. He was a young theologian at Catholic University, and the day after Humanae Vitae came out, he held a press conference on the steps of Catholic University of America and said that Catholics were under no obligation to obey Humanae Vitae, that it had been, that it was based on an inadequate notion of the natural law, and that they could follow their own consciences. Now that was 1968. The commission ended its work in 1966. Someone, most likely Bernard Herring, there's good evidence for this, leaked the documents to 3 major Catholic newspapers, the National Catholic Reporter in the United States, the Le Monde in Paris, and the Tablet in London. In the spring of 1967, they were tired, well, the summer of 1967, they were tired of waiting for Paul VI to write an encyclical. He said he was going to do that. He got the documents from the special commission, and he's prayed about it for a long time. And he decided he couldn't change the church's teaching. This wasn't man's law, it was God's law. The church couldn't change its teaching on abortion tomorrow. That's God's law, not man's law. So Pope Paul VI wrote Humanae Vitae, but for that year, between 1967 and 1968, the world knew that this special commission had voted that the church could and should change its teaching. So they were all excited. The church is going to have to change its teaching. That's what the special commission decided. Well, I've been on just a handful of little commission type things, and we're basically sworn to secrecy of what goes on. And we know very much that our role is advisory. We're not making the decision. We're helping the Holy Father, whoever we're helping, a bishop, whoever, make a decision. But someone decided to put all this political pressure on the church and on the Holy Father to change the church's teaching on contraception. As I mentioned, Charlie Curran immediately held a press conference on the steps of Catholic U and told Catholics they did not have to abide by this teaching. Something like 150 priests in Washington, D.C. signed a petition saying they would not preach on the church's teaching on contraception. They would not support it. And Cardinal O'Boyle suspended most of their faculties and told them they had to sign a statement of compliance. They had to retract their dissent. And they appealed to Rome, and Rome supported the priests. They told Cardinal O'Boyle to restore their faculties. Now, that was under Paul VI, right? He wrote the document. Now, why would he have done that? They were actually afraid of schism. They were actually afraid that the church was going to split. And actually, for about the next 15 years or so, there was a lot of talk about an American Catholic Church and a Roman Catholic Church. There's a little bit of talk now about a German Catholic Church and a Roman Catholic Church. You have a group of cardinals and bishops who don't comply with what Rome is telling them is the church's teaching. So I lived with this little bit of prospect for some time in the 70s and 80s that there actually might be a split in the church. There might be an American Catholic Church and a Roman Catholic Church. So if you hear that now, you're going to be hearing something that was, this is deja vu all over again. So it was a time of great turmoil. As I said, because of Bernard Herring and Fuchs, the dissent took off immediately. And quite immediately, the seminaries were full of dissenting theologians who taught the priests who were being prepared for the priesthood. Catholic universities were being, the major theologians there were dissenting from church teaching. It was very difficult. You heard not a word about it from the pulpit. It's quite interesting. The U.S. bishops have asked the bishops of the United States, every one of them, to put in place a plan for teaching Humanae Vitae in the parishes. And in Michigan, this is the weekend. I'm here. That's okay, I'm here. I'm glad to be here. But in Michigan, this is the weekend, and at least in my Diocese of Lansing, all the priests have been asked to preach on Humanae Vitae. And the bishops of the Archdiocese of Detroit, Vigneron, and the auxiliary bishops are going to key parishes to defend Humanae Vitae. That's 50 years later, okay? That was not done back in 1968. Yes, that's great, good news. What did happen in 1968 is Pope Paul VI anticipated dissent because he'd seen what happened with the commission and how it was treated in the media. He asked the bishops all over the world to issue statements of support for Humanae Vitae, bishop conferences, and they all did. But some of them, their statements of support were very weak, about 12 or 15 of them, where they basically said that in conscience, Catholics could do what they felt right about this issue. Of course, they never say that about, racism or greed or anything like that. Just do what your conscience tells you. Say, no, form your conscience in accord with the truth. That's what the church teaches. At any rate, dissent started going crazy. Once people started dissenting on contraception, they dissented on masturbation, fornication, divorce, homosexuality, women priests, etc. So when I was in graduate school and then I taught at Notre Dame for 9 years, I mean, the dissent was just incredible. And if you were trying to promote the church's teaching on anything, again, you were considered to be this backwards person that just wasn't on the right side of history, right? And you were an unsophisticated thinker. Cardinal Schönborn made an incredible statement a couple years ago. There were a number of people who had signed a document saying that talking about signing statements of dissent against contraception. Cardinal Schönborn accused the signatories of weakening the people of God's sense for life, so that the wave of abortions and increasing acceptance of homosexuality followed, the church lacked the courage to oppose them. So he said when the church didn't defend its own teaching on contraception, meaning the bishops and the priests, once abortion was made legal, which was just a few years later, they didn't have anywhere to stand, because now dissent was permissible. You don't have to accept church teaching. When homosexuality is being pushed, the majority of Catholics now accept same-sex unions. The majority. Right? He says there were a few memorable exceptions in 1968, the Cardinal said, one of which was in Krakow, where a group of theologians led by the Archbishop and Cardinal of Krakow, the future Pope John Paul II, drew up a memorandum which was sent to Pope Paul VI, urging him to write Humanae Vitae. He wrote a beautiful document, pro the church's teaching. He was on that special commission that was meant to advise Paul VI, but he was never allowed to go to Rome by the Polish government to meet with the commission. But he got all the documents. So he gathered a group of people together, and he wrote a document about why contraception was wrong. He'd already written that book, Love and Responsibility, in 1959, 1960. Beautiful. He was ready. He was totally ready. Right? So he guided Paul VI a great deal in the writing of Humanae Vitae. He wrote his own document in response, or he had his theologians write a document in response to the documents that came out of the Special Commission. And furthermore, Schönborn says, those bishops, said Cardinal Schönborn, were frightened of the press and of being misunderstood by the faithful. Blame lay not only with the bishops responsible at the time, none of whom is still alive, but with all the bishops for the fact that Europe is about to die out. I think that it is also our sin as bishops, even if none of us were bishops in 1968, he added. Bishops have not had or did not have the courage to swim against the tide and say yes to Humanae Vitae, is what he said. Cardinal Stafford has a most remarkable statement. He was a young priest, maybe ordained 6 or 7 or 8 years by 1968. Things are going faster now. He wants me to go faster. He was a young priest in Baltimore at the time. He said, the minute Humanae Vitae came out, a priest of the diocese called a meeting of the other priests of the diocese to meet in the basement of one of the churches. And he said there was amazing pressure put on every priest there to sign a statement of dissent against Humanae Vitae, though none of them had read the document. Right? And this is how he tells it. There were, as you remember, in 1968, there were riots on the streets all the time for all sorts of reasons. Politics, racism, all sorts of things. The violence of the priests' August gathering gave rise to its own ferocious acrimony. Conversations among the clergy, where they existed, became contaminated with fear. Suspicions among priests were chronic, fears abounded, and they continue. The archdiocesan priesthood lost something of the fraternal whole which Baltimore priests had known for generations. Some priests saw bishops as nothing more than Roman mannequins. He said he was in this room, the youngest priest. He said they were asked to go around and to say aloud whether they would sign a statement of dissent. Everyone said yes but him. He was the last one in the room. But you can imagine the courage that took for a young priest to be the only one to go against that. He said something else happened among priests on that violent August night. Friendship in the church sustained a direct hit. Jesus, by calling those who were with him his friends, had made friendship a privileged analogy of the church. That analogy became obscured after a large number of priests expressed shame over their leaders and repudiated their teaching. He says, abusive, coercive dissent has become a reality in the church and subjects her to violent, it's almost as good as Luther, subjects her to violent, debilitating, unproductive, chronic controversies. But I did discover something new. Others also did. When the moment of Christian witness came, no Christian could be coerced who refused to be. Despite the novelty of being treated as an object of shame and ridicule, I did not become ashamed of the gospel that night and found sweet delight in what is right. And it was not a bad lesson. Ecclesial obedience ran the distance. So Stafford, it paints a very true and sad picture that from that point on, it used to be the priest, when they saw another priest, you knew you had a brother in the Lord, right? You were both fighting the same fight, right? You were living the same life. And now you're on opposite teams. You're on the dissenting team and I'm on the faithful team. And the faithful team was got to be more and more in the minority. Right? So there's a marvelous little book about this by Ralph McInerney, What Went Wrong with Vatican II. And he really doesn't think anything went wrong with Vatican II. He actually thinks the dissent against Humanae Vitae, reading Vatican II, the spirit of Vatican II, rather than the letter of Vatican II was the problem. So that's where we've lived for a long time. But there's good news. There's good news. And one of the big pieces of good news, of course, is John Paul II. As I mentioned, he was enthusiastic for the Church's teaching on contraception before 10 years before Humanae Vitae was written. He was one of its foremost defenders when it came out. Every continent that he went to, he spoke about the Church's teaching on natural family planning and the family and the wrongness of contraception and abortion. I think when the Holy Spirit was looking for someone to be the Holy Father, he was only 58. He was only 58 when he became the Holy Father. And I think the Holy Spirit was looking for someone who could fight communism, which of course was John Paul II. Some people attribute the fall of communism very much to John Paul II, a friendship he had with Reagan, all sorts of things he did. Look into it if you're interested. It's fascinating. Of course, he wanted a preferential option for the poor. He lived a very frugal, abstemious life of his own. But if there was anybody on the face of the earth that could defend the Church's teaching on contraception, it was John Paul II. And if there's anything our time needs, is someone who thinks right about sexuality. And John Paul II did, better than anybody. Right? And then he wrote the book, not then, but before he became Holy Father, he wrote the Theology of the Body. He wrote this long before he became Holy Father. Right? He showed up with a manuscript that he cut into little Wednesday audiences, right? A couple chapters at a time. Over 5 years, he delivered them. And it's revolutionized our thinking about Humanae Vitae. It's a theological defense of the Church's teaching on contraception. It's based on Scripture. If you haven't done any theology of the body stuff, do it. I think there's a table over here for some of the workshops that you can attend. Well, his theology of the body made it into all sorts of documents, into Familiaris Consortio, into the Catechism of the Catholic Church, into Veritatis Splendor, into Evangelium Vitae, and many other sub-documents. You can't imagine what it was like when the Catechism of the Catholic Church came out, for those of us who had been trying to defend the Church's teaching. Because any time we'd say something, the Church teaches X, someone would say, but Father so-and-so at Notre Dame teaches this, or Father so-and-so at Fordham teaches this, or Father so-and-so, and you're just sort of left there standing. And now you can pick up the Catechism and say, I think I'll go with the Catechism. I think I'll go with the Catechism. And it was such an enormous gift to the Church. There's also been recognition by the Church. And again, the bishops that are here now are not the bishops that were there then. So, you know, we can't always be mad at the bishops. But there was a beautiful thing that happened in the Philippines. The Philippine bishops apologized to the Philippine people for not defending the Church's teaching. In a document, they said, it's said that when seeking ways of regulating births, only 5% of you consult God. Those were the number that were using natural family planning. In the face of this unfortunate fact, we, your pastors, have been remiss. How few are there among you whom we have reached? There have been some couples eager to share their expertise and values on birth regulation with others. They did not receive adequate support from their bishops. We did not give them due attention, believing then this ministry consisted merely of imparting a technique best left to married couples. I love this line. Only recently have we discovered how deep your yearning is for God to be present in your married lives. The bishops are saying, we didn't know how much you were willing to sacrifice to be followers of Christ. We didn't know that. We thought you wanted an easy way, right? But you don't. You want to say, Jesus, what does Jesus want? I want to do what Jesus wants me to do. Again, if there's one truth I've found in my life that's an absolute truth, it's that God's will is better than mine, right? God's will is always better than mine, right? So if ever you get in a tug of war with God, you say, I want this, but I know God wants that, give in, all right? You give in fast, all right? Because you can be sure that if that is God's will, that is better than whatever you're hooking up, right? He says, only recently have we discovered how deep your yearning is for God to be present in your married lives. But we did not know then how to help you discover God's presence and activity in your mission of Christian parenting. Afflicted with doubts about alternatives to contraceptive technology, we abandoned you to your confused and lonely consciences with a lame excuse. Follow what your conscience tells you. How little we realized that it was our consciences that needed to be formed. A greater concern would have led us to discover that religious hunger in you. That's one of the most humble statements I've ever read, right? Bishops apologizing to the faithful and saying, we didn't give you what you needed. Your faith was stronger than ours, all right? And it was our consciences that need to be formed. Now, there's lots of good signs in the United States, at least, lots of good signs. We had the resistance of the U.S. bishops 100% against the HHS mandate, which was forcing Catholic institutions to pay for insurance policies that paid for contraception. U.S. bishops did a marvelous job. As I said, now the U.S. bishops have asked the bishops around the United States to preach on Humanae Vitae. The seminaries have been reformed. Our priests, young priests sometimes have to go into rectories where a priest was formed 40, 50 years ago, and he was taught that the church's teaching on contraception is wrong. It's a difficult situation because our young men believe it 100%. There's a little tug of war there, you know. Well, just let the couples do what their conscience tells them to. And they say, no, we've learned that's not right. And they're able to defend it well. But there's not a seminary in the United States that's not better now than it was even 20 years ago. And some of them are absolutely top of the notch, excellent places, right? The young men are getting the best education they could get anywhere. They're getting it in the seminaries. I had another slide in there, but it's not there. I was going to show the University of Dallas, of course. The reform and establishment of, I gave this talk in Ave Maria, that's why there's Ave Maria's picture there, but I wanted University of Dallas, which is one of the best Catholic colleges there are. There's people like Benedictine College or Belmont Abbey that have radically changed in the last 15 years or so. They're so faithful now and so good. The kids coming out of those schools, one time we had to rely upon Steubenville, Thomas Aquinas College, Dallas, and maybe one or two others. And now some of these little colleges that were kind of nowhere 20, 25 years ago have now become powerhouses of Catholic fidelity. There's unbelievable natural family planning groups. Couple to Couple League, Family of Americas, Pope Paul VI Institute, BOMA, a group called FEM. One of the great new websites is Natural Womanhood. It's a marvelous website for all sorts of information on women's reproductive cycles, contraception, what's wrong with them, natural family planning. It's really, it's a very a top line as far as scientific research, the best studies possible. A really interesting study came out a couple years ago, what Catholic women think about faith, conscience, and contraception. This was part of their press release when it came out. It said, highlights from the groundbreaking research include the finding, they talked like about 1,500 women or so at length about their belief, what their faith was, what their church attendance was, what their belief was about church's teaching on contraception. It said, highlights from the groundbreaking research include the finding that while only 13% of church-going Catholic women completely accept the church's teaching on family planning, which I have to admit, I'm sorry to say, sounds high to me. I'm not happy with 13%, but if it had been 5%, I wouldn't have been surprised. But 13% accept the church's teaching. In our culture, where they've never been taught it, that's not bad. But acceptance doubles up to 27% among young women 18 to 34. Now that's the group that you think would most be wanting to use contraception, right? But their number is double, just sort of any old Catholic woman who attend Mass weekly, right? So 27% of women between 18 and 34 accept the church's teaching on contraception. I want to say, awesome, all right? Somebody's been doing a good job. I mean, I want that to be 100%, of course, but that surely wasn't the case 20 years ago, and it wasn't the case 40 years ago. It says it climbs still higher to 37% among women who both attend Mass weekly and have been to confession within the past year, right? They're living by the church's teaching. When you live by the church's teaching, in other respects, going to Mass, going to confession, I'm sure praying, other teachings of the church become more palatable to you. It's also very interesting that the world is starting to catch on to how bad contraception is for women physically. Every time I turn around, this was in, I think it was the New York Times, it's a little video on this woman tried all these different contraceptives and all the bad side effects on them. New York Times, right? Not for religious reasons, for health reasons. This woman thought it was awful. There's a book out called The Sweetening of the Pill. It's a woman who used the pill for 20 years and finally read up on what it was doing to her body and said, I can't believe it. She went off of it and she felt so much better she couldn't believe it. And she thinks women are being taught mountains of lies about contraception. So Ricky Lake, talk show host, has read this book and she's doing a documentary on how bad contraception is. It's much like, their documentary is much like the documentaries on tobacco, where terrible people knew how bad tobacco was for people and kept it quiet because of the profits that the companies were making. Well, people have known for a very long time how bad contraception is for women, but aren't making a big stink about that because of it would have to change everybody's lifestyle, and the amount of money that the pharmaceuticals would lose would be enormous. Another part of the good news is that there's conferences, as we've said, all over the United States. There was one just a couple weeks ago at the Catholic University of America, which was delicious in its own way because, as I said, Charlie Curran started the dissent on the steps of the Catholic University of America. They did not support him. They actually denied him tenure, and then he got it back, and then they disciplined him some 17 years later. But the president of Catholic U was at this event, and he was just so proud that Catholic U was hosting this event. And it is the most distinguished academic conference of the year that's held at Catholic U. I can't give an advertisement for all of them, but there's another huge one going on in California on the very dates of the anniversary of Humanae Vitae. All right, well, I'm going to actually stop there because I know we ran a little over. Maybe we can get we started a little late. We can get back on track, and I've got another talk that I'll update you on 1,000 things. I'm sorry for the timing. I'm sure that's something, I didn't do it, but it's in my program. Somehow something got in there and did it. But we'll talk more this afternoon. Thank you.